trends since November that I think are really important to keep in mind. The first is that support for Donald Trump has basically remained pretty flat since the election. His job approval rating has remained somewhere around the 40% mark overall, which suggests that even though he lost the election, even though he's sort of engaged in a lot of things to contest the election, he's not really shook his support with his base. The other thing is that in that base, we've seen a very rapid acceptance of this idea that Trump lost the election because it was rigged or illegitimate for some reason. And the reasons sort of fluctuate a little bit. But, we went from in the day or two right after the election of Republicans, a minority of Republicans saying that the election was rigged or illegitimate or whatever, to once Biden was sort of announced to be the winner 4 or 5 days later, a majority, and then that number's pretty much continued to be the case, north of 50% of Republicans saying that this election was illegitimate, despite there being no real evidence to support that.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Look, when we look at the data, we see huge political polarization, obviously. But that political polarization extends across other divides, across race, even across age to a certain extent, across education and social class. So this is such a big issue, and we have to be very clear about where it's coming from. It is stemming from politicians, many of them aiming to create political theater and a future for them. And we see that because what we saw at the Capitol are Republicans. Overwhelmingly, there were still many in the House, and then there were 6 in the Senate, who decided to continuously double down on contesting the election. But overall, we saw a lot of Republicans retreat, suggesting that this is part of political theater. We see it from Republicans, we see it from Democrats, and that then leads and spills over into cable news. And we know the divisions among cable news and how they now pretty much fall along party lines. That then spills over or comes also from social media and then feeds into people. So we see at every level of the way that people are gaining information and connecting with government, we see political polarization. And that spillover is the coup, in a sense, that we saw yesterday with domestic terrorists going into the Capitol. And so, look, I don't see this ending anytime soon. The division, we're going to continuously see it into the Biden-Harris administration. I do think that Biden, given his history in politics, him going from being the youngest senator at the time to now pretty much being one of the oldest presidents, that if someone can hopefully bring politicians together so that there are various pieces of information that starts to be disseminated that are at least objectionable in terms of being objective and fair, then I think we'll get to a point where people can get fair information to make decisions about what's going on.
I think that's a good point, though. I think that the directionality of the relationship is a big question mark, because what we see in a lot of our public opinion data is it is really not just your partisanship, but where you get your news from, where you get your information from, that drives a lot of these attitudes. For instance, among Republicans, it is overwhelmingly Republicans who primarily get their news from Fox News and other conservative media sources who are rejecting this election as illegitimate. And among Republicans who instead sort of use more sort of mainstream outlets like the network news or the major national newspapers, it's actually just a plurality in that group. So there's even huge splits within Republicans by that news source focus. And I think you see sort of that relationship between the president and the cable news outlets, where he sort of sets an agenda and then they amplify it and amplify it and amplify it. And then you end up with people in Congress Republicans in Congress particularly, who just sort of go along with the ride thinking that that's going to be the way they get an advantage. I don't think that they necessarily control it. I think they're just sort of trying to ride the wave as much as anyone else is. And the only ones who do control it is the president, of course, and then those sort of people who are deciding programming for the news outlets.
We got to be very clear how rare this is. The last time this happened was the War of 1812, where the United States was still trying to sort out its independence from Great Britain. So this is not something that happens. And the bottom line is this: we have to ask ourselves, as much as people might want to storm the Capitol, and Those who follow what happens in DC and knows what's going on, we know that people try to do this regularly. Oftentimes it's an individual jumping the fence or scaling the fence, but there are credible threats on a regular basis to government buildings and the Capitol and the White House. And those things are shut down. So we have to ask ourselves, what was different about what happened with the storming of the Capitol with domestic terrorists? The key question is, imagine if they were not white. Imagine if the people we saw scaling that fence were Black or Muslim or Latino. Imagine the differences in the response. We simply have to look at images, even from 2020, from Black Lives Matter protests, and the number of law enforcement agencies and armed guards who were protecting property over people. We did not see that yesterday. And instead, we saw law enforcement taking pictures and selfies with domestic terrorists, opening up gates. And part of that is because the work that I do on policing, I know that there's a segment of law enforcement that also holds similar attitudes to those domestic terrorists that we saw there. And we have to be very clear about that. So the investigation that needs to happen needs to go from the top to the bottom. But again, the polarization we're seeing, the messaging that people are receiving, if people never receive objective information and instead only receive opinion-based information, it completely skews them. And we have to get to a point where we get back to objective and fair reporting in terms of what information people seek out.
Yeah, and to continue on for that point, I think it's important to note that objective, fact-based information has never really been the primary driver of human behavior. Instead, it's emotion, it's feeling. And one of the things we've seen is that the media sort of generally and President Trump specifically have become increasingly adept at being able to play to emotions and really gin up a very heightened sense of emotion. So we are presented with a situation where, for instance, just before the election in Ipsos polling, we found that 3/4 of Americans believe the election was a battle for the soul of the nation, right? This very loaded, emotional sort of term that a supermajority of people on both sides agree with. And I think when you have this sort of environment where everything is seen as being intensely, intensely important at the same time that the other side is being constantly demonized, where the other side is oftentimes not even seen as fully human, it's easy to start allowing for these creeping into things like violence, like unrest, like protests. And I think one of the problems we've seen in particularly sort of in society writ large, and particularly with the Republican Party, is how they've essentially acquiesced to that. And in the past, when that kind of thing has happened, you've seen a relatively cohesive elite response condemning that. And that hasn't necessarily happened during the Trump administration. We have really seen that happen in the last 12 hours, where, except for a couple of, extreme conservative outlets, most even conservative commentators have come out condemning the insurrectionists in the Capitol building. And we have data at Ipsos that we'll be releasing today, where we did a snap poll ourselves yesterday, and then we've done another one this morning, and we're seeing opinion shifting against the protesters, against the objection to the certification of the election. And I think that's because we're seeing this real consensus of people condemning the event. We're not really seeing the same type of, oh, it's okay, it's not that big of a deal. But it is worrying that, immediately after that, you have almost half of Republicans saying like, oh, that's actually okay because it serves our political interests. One of the big questions is going to be what happens around support for President Trump. Like I mentioned earlier, his job approval ratings have remained remarkably stable despite losing and contesting the election. But we've seen a lot of Republicans and a lot of even conservative news outlets object to his behavior over the last 24 hours. And the question is, does that actually start to move people? And if so, does that start to free up more of the Republican Party to object and to start charting a path different from Trumpism? I think that's an open question. I think, 24, 48 hours ago, Trumpism was definitely the primary driver of the Republican Party and its near-term future. But now, after the recent events at the Capitol, I think that's a little bit more of an open question. I think that's what we're going to have to watch over the next couple of days. And I think Trump's job approval is going to be the measure that's going to tell us the most about that.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think there are two big things I'm going to be looking for. is first is what's going to happen with Trump. I can completely see him. I think one of the things he's aiming to do is to take his viewers, his supporters, to another media outlet. We have to be very clear. He's a businessman first. I think that's how he's thinking. How many of those individuals is he going to be able to take with him? And how much is that going to continue to drive polarization, even though he's not going to be in politics? Second is how much is Biden going to really be able to speak to the soul of the nation? Not just Democrats who supported them and the many additional millions of people who came out to vote, some for the first time, but also Republicans and more independents who are saying, you know what, yeah, I'm conservative, but I'm not extreme. I'm not a domestic terrorist, nor am I part of the alt-right or white nationalism or white supremacy. So it's going to be very interesting to see how much Biden is going to be able to drive the media cycle, similarly to the way Trump has driven it for the past 4 years, similar to the way that Obama did it before. It's unclear if Biden is going to be able to do that, or if there are going to be additional kind of liberal or progressive voices that are going to come to the forefront that can hopefully unify America. Because the way it's looking right now, I'm unsure if that's going to happen based on the increasing percentage of people who are getting their news outside of mainstream cable news. They are going to be able to go to these alternative sites that Trump and other people similar to him might continue to be able to dominate, and that might drive polarization even more.